The morning mist hung low over the training grounds as General Morrison walked slowly down the line of his best marksmen. Each soldier stood at attention, their rifles gleaming in the early sunlight. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the elite snipers of the 42nd Special Forces Division, men who could thread a needle at 1,000 meters and hit a moving target in complete darkness. "Gentlemen," the general's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We have a problem that requires extraordinary precision." He stopped walking and turned to face the assembled group. "Intelligence reports indicate that enemy forces have positioned a high-value target at an unprecedented distance. The shot required is 4,000 meters, 4 kilometers of open ground, wind patterns that change every 100 meters, and a target window of less than 30 seconds. Sergeant Collins, the unit's top sniper with over 200 confirmed kills, shifted uncomfortably. He had made shots at 3,200 meters before, but 4,000 was entering the realm of the impossible. The mathematics alone were staggering. At that distance, the bullet would travel for over 4 seconds, dropping nearly 40 feet due to gravity, and even the slightest wind could push it meters off course. "The mission briefing is simple," General Morrison continued, pulling out a detailed topographical map. "Our target is Colonel Petrov, the enemy's chief strategist. He has been planning attacks from a fortified position on Hill 847. Every day at 0800 hours, he steps onto the observation deck for exactly 28 seconds to survey the valley below. Satellite imagery shows this is our only window. Miss this opportunity, and he disappears back into the underground bunker system for another 24 hours. Lieutenant Hayes, a young sniper with exceptional mathematical skills, raised his hand slightly. "Sir, at 4,000 meters, we're dealing with a flight time of approximately 4.2 seconds. The Coriolis effect alone will deflect the bullet by nearly 18 inches. Add wind variance, humidity, and temperature gradients, and the margin for error becomes impossible," finished Captain Rodriguez, the unit's most experienced long-range specialist. "Sir, with respect, we've been pushing the boundaries of sniper technology for years. Our current equipment, even with the finest adjustments, cannot guarantee accuracy beyond 3,500 meters. The variables are simply too numerous." General Morrison nodded grimly. "I understand your concerns, gentlemen. That's precisely why I've assembled you here. We have 3 days to find a solution. Our intelligence suggests that if Colonel Petrov completes his current strategic planning, our forces in the eastern sector will face casualties in the thousands." The next 72 hours became a blur of calculations, equipment modifications, and practice sessions. The team worked with ballistics experts, meteorologists, and even consulted with Olympic shooting coaches. They tried everything: modified ammunition, enhanced scopes with computerized wind-reading capabilities, and even experimental stabilization platforms. Sergeant Collins made the first attempt on a practice range set up to simulate the actual conditions. His shot, perfectly calculated and executed, landed 43 meters short of the target. The bullet had simply run out of energy, its trajectory ending in the dirt well before reaching the intended mark. Captain Rodriguez tried a different approach, using a heavier grain ammunition and adjusting for what he calculated would be the optimal trajectory. His bullet sailed over the target by nearly 60 meters, the increased powder charge sending it too high despite his downward angle adjustments. Lieutenant Hayes, with his mathematical precision, spent an entire day creating computer models that accounted for every possible variable. His calculations were flawless on paper, but when translated to reality, the shot veered left by 37 meters due to an unexpected thermal updraft that his models hadn't predicted. Day after day, attempt after attempt, each sniper faced the same frustrating reality. The distance was simply beyond human capability with conventional methods. Master Sergeant Thompson, a veteran with 15 years of sniper experience, came closer than anyone with his 8th attempt, missing by only 12 meters. But in the world of precision shooting, 12 meters might as well be 12 miles. The equipment isn't the limiting factor, observed Dr. Sarah Chen, the ballistics expert who had been brought in to assist. The rifles are capable of sending bullets that far. The scopes can see the target clearly. The issue is the accumulation of micro-variables that become macro-problems over such an extreme distance. As the deadline approached, frustration mounted. These men had never failed a mission. They were used to achieving the impossible, threading bullets through windows, around obstacles, and hitting targets others couldn't even see. But 4,000 meters was proving to be an insurmountable barrier. On the final evening before the mission was scheduled to take place, General Morrison gathered his team in the briefing room. The atmosphere was heavy with disappointment and concern. "Gentlemen, I want you to know that your efforts have been extraordinary. Sometimes, even the best soldiers face challenges that push beyond the boundaries of human capability." "Sir," Sergeant Collins spoke up, his voice tight with frustration. "We've made 13 attempts. Every conceivable approach, every possible adjustment. The mathematics simply don't work in our favor at this distance." The general was about to respond when there was a quiet knock at the briefing room door. A young administrative assistant entered hesitantly. "Excuse me, General Morrison, but there's someone here who says she might be able to help with your long-distance shooting problem." Every man in the room turned to look at her with surprise. Word of their mission was supposed to be classified at the highest levels. "What do you mean?" the general asked carefully. "Well, sir, her name is Elena Kowalski. She's here visiting her brother who works in the motor pool. Apparently she overheard some of the soldiers talking about impossible long-distance shots, and she says she might have some experience that could help." The room fell silent. The idea that a civilian, particularly a woman with no apparent military background, could solve a problem that had stumped the military's elite snipers seemed almost insulting. Yet desperation makes people consider options they might otherwise dismiss. "Bring her in," General Morrison said finally. A few minutes later, Elena Kowalski entered the briefing room. She was in her early 30s, of average height, with calloused hands that spoke of manual work and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings with quiet intensity. She wore simple civilian clothes and carried herself with an understated confidence that immediately caught the attention of every soldier in the room. "Ma'am," General Morrison said politely but skeptically, "I understand you believe you might be able to assist with a technical shooting problem we're experiencing?" Elena nodded quietly. "My grandfather taught me to hunt in the mountains of Poland when I was very young. Later, when I moved to Canada, I continued hunting in the Rockies. I've been taking long-range shots in mountain conditions for over 20 years. Captain Rodriguez couldn't hide his skepticism. "Ma'am, with all due respect, hunting and military sniping are entirely different disciplines. The precision required for our current mission is beyond anything typically encountered in civilian hunting situations." Elena's expression remained calm. "I understand your doubts, Captain, but I've been making successful shots at distances exceeding 3,800 meters for the past 5 years. Not on ranges, not in controlled conditions, but in the field, tracking elk and mountain goats in terrain where a missed shot means days of additional hunting." The room erupted in quiet murmurs. Lieutenant Hayes leaned forward. "Ma'am, if I may ask, what equipment do you use?" "The civilian hunting rifles available to the public typically aren't designed for such extreme distances. I use a modified hunting rifle that belonged to my grandfather, combined with some custom adjustments I've made over the years. But more importantly, I use techniques for reading natural conditions that I learned from him, methods that aren't typically taught in military training programs." Sergeant Collins exchanged glances with his fellow snipers. "What kind of techniques?" Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your approach seems to rely heavily on mathematical calculations and technological solutions. These are valuable, but at extreme distances, you also need to develop an intuitive understanding of how the natural environment affects bullet flight. Things like reading thermals by watching bird behavior. understanding how moisture patterns create invisible wind corridors, and sensing atmospheric pressure changes through physical cues. The soldiers looked at each other with growing interest. Despite their initial skepticism, Elena was discussing concepts that their extensive training had touched on but never fully explored. General Morrison made a decision that would change everything. "Ms. Kowalski, would you be willing to make an attempt at our range tomorrow morning, under the same conditions our team has been working with?" Elena nodded simply. "I'd be honored to try, General." As the meeting broke up and Elena was escorted to temporary quarters, the elite snipers found themselves in the unusual position of doubting their own expertise. They had dedicated their careers to mastering their craft, using the most advanced equipment and techniques available. Yet here was a civilian hunter claiming she could accomplish what they had failed to achieve 13 times over. The night before Elena's attempt, none of the snipers slept well. Their professional pride was at stake, but more importantly, they were beginning to realize that perhaps their approach had been missing something fundamental about the art of extreme, long-range shooting. Tomorrow would determine whether traditional military precision or intuitive natural understanding would solve the impossible equation of the 4,000-meter shot. Dawn broke with an unusual stillness across the training range. Elena Kowalski arrived at the firing position 30 minutes before the scheduled demonstration, carrying a weathered rifle case that looked like it had seen decades of mountain hunting. The contrast between her simple equipment and the sophisticated gear used by the military snipers was immediately apparent to everyone present. General Morrison and his entire sniper team gathered around as Elena unpacked her rifle. The weapon was clearly custom-modified, but retained the basic appearance of a traditional hunting rifle. What caught everyone's attention, however, were the unusual modifications: a scope that appeared to be a combination of several different optical systems, a custom-built stock with multiple adjustment points, and a barrel that had been carefully modified with what appeared to be hand-machined components. "This rifle belonged to my grandfather," Elena explained as she assembled the weapon with practiced efficiency. He was a resistance fighter during World War II, and after the war he became one of Poland's most successful mountain hunters. Every modification you see here was developed through decades of trial and error in actual hunting situations. Sergeant Collins examined the rifle with professional curiosity. "Ma'am, I don't recognize some of these components. This scope configuration, for instance. It appears to combine multiple magnification systems." Elena nodded. "My grandfather discovered that at extreme distances, you need different optical perspectives simultaneously. This scope allows me to see both the target area and the environmental conditions between me and the target at the same time. Most scopes force you to choose between target focus and environmental awareness." She pointed to various features on the rifle. "These adjustment points on the stock aren't just for comfort. They allow me to modify the rifle's balance point depending on the shooting angle and the atmospheric conditions. At 4,000 meters, even the weapon's balance affects bullet trajectory." Dr. Sarah Chen, the ballistics expert, looked intrigued. "Ms. Kowalski, these modifications appear to be based on principles that our current military equipment doesn't fully address. Have you tested these concepts scientifically?" Elena smiled slightly. "Every successful hunt was a scientific test, Dr. Chen. When you're tracking an elk for 3 days and you finally get one shot at extreme distance, failure means your family doesn't eat that winter. That's a different kind of pressure than range testing." Lieutenant Hayes pulled out his calculator and weather monitoring equipment. "Ma'am, I've calculated the environmental conditions for this morning. Wind speed is 4.2 miles per hour from the southwest. Humidity at 67%, temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit, and barometric pressure is 30.15 inches of mercury. Based on these readings, I can provide you with the optimal firing solution." Elena looked at the young officer kindly, but shook her head. "Thank you, Lieutenant, but I prefer to read the conditions myself. Your instruments tell you what's happening at this location, but I need to understand what's happening along the entire bullet path." She walked away from the firing position and began what appeared to be a careful examination of the surrounding area. The snipers watched with growing fascination as Elena observed things they had never considered relevant to long-range shooting. First, she spent several minutes watching birds in the distance, noting how they flew and at what altitudes they seemed to encounter turbulence. She picked up handfuls of dust and released them at various heights, observing how the particles behaved in the air currents. She even lay down on the ground and pressed her ear to the earth, listening for sounds that might indicate underground water sources that could create thermal effects. "What exactly is she doing?" Captain Rodriguez asked quietly. Master Sergeant Thompson, watching Elena's actions with growing respect, provided an explanation. "She's reading the environment the way our ancestors did before we had electronic instruments. Look at how she's mapping the terrain between here and the target. She's identifying every factor that could influence bullet flight, but she's doing it through direct observation instead of mathematical calculation." After 20 minutes of environmental assessment, Elena returned to the firing position. She began adjusting her rifle in ways that seemed completely intuitive, making micro changes to the stock configuration, scope settings, and even the way she positioned herself relative to the weapon. "The conditions are interesting this morning," she told the assembled group. "There's a thermal layer about 800 meters out, created by a small stream that runs underground through that area. It's creating an updraft that will affect bullet trajectory. Additionally, there's a pressure front moving in from the northwest that's creating wind shear patterns at different altitudes." Dr. Chen looked at her instruments, then back at Elena. "How can you determine thermal layers and pressure fronts without meteorological equipment?" Elena pointed to various natural indicators. "See how those birds are circling at different heights about 800 meters out? They're riding thermals. Notice how the grass moves in that area compared to the surrounding zones. The pattern tells you about underground water. The way clouds are forming on the horizon indicates pressure changes that will affect air density along the bullet path." She settled into her firing position with a fluidity that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. Her body alignment, breathing pattern, and weapon control were noticeably different from military shooting techniques, yet they conveyed a sense of absolute confidence and natural integration with the rifle. "The shot window begins in 30 seconds, General Morrison announced, checking his watch. Elena's breathing slowed and deepened. Unlike the military snipers who relied on precise timing and controlled breathing techniques, her approach seemed more organic, as if she was synchronizing herself with the natural rhythm of the environment around her. The target appeared right on schedule, a silhouette at 4,000 meters that represented Colonel Petrov stepping onto his observation deck. At that distance, even through powerful scopes, the target appeared as little more than a dark speck against the hillside. Elena's finger found the trigger. For several seconds, she remained perfectly still, not just waiting for the right moment to fire, but seeming to sense something that the sophisticated instruments around her couldn't measure. Then, with a movement so smooth it appeared effortless, she squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the range, and the assembled group immediately turned their attention to spotting scopes and monitoring equipment to track the bullet's flight. At 4,000 meters, it would take over 4 seconds for the bullet to reach its target. "Bullet away," called out Lieutenant Hayes, tracking the projectile's path through his scope. "Flight time approximately 4.1 seconds. The seconds stretched endlessly as everyone watched and waited. Master Sergeant Thompson, observing through high-powered optics, began calling out the bullet's progress. 1,000 meters, on trajectory. 2,000 meters, maintaining path. 3,000 meters, still tracking toward target. At 3,500 meters, where many of the previous attempts had failed, Elena's bullet continued its steady flight toward the distant target. The mathematical precision of its arc seemed to defy the accumulated errors that had plagued the 13 previous attempts. 4,000 meters, impact! Through the scopes, they could see that the target had been hit dead center. The precision was so perfect that for a moment the entire group fell silent in disbelief. Dr. Chen was the first to speak. "That's impossible. The statistical probability of achieving that level of accuracy at this distance, given all the environmental variables, should be essentially zero." Elena was already unloading her rifle, her manner calm and matter-of-fact. "The shot felt right," she said simply. "All the environmental factors aligned properly, and the rifle was telling me it was ready." General Morrison stared at the distant target through his binoculars, then looked back at Elena with a mixture of amazement and professional admiration. "Ms. Kowalski, in 30 years of military service, I have never witnessed marksmanship of this caliber. How did you know the conditions were right?" Elena considered the question carefully. "General, your team approaches long-range shooting as a mathematical problem to be solved through calculation and technology. That's valuable, but it's only part of the equation. At extreme distances, you're not just fighting physics. You're working with natural forces that are constantly changing in ways that instruments can't fully measure." She gestured toward the distant target. "I didn't calculate the exact wind speed or humidity percentage. Instead, I learned to feel how all those conditions work together as a complete system. The thermal currents, pressure changes, moisture patterns, they all create a kind of signature that you can read if you know how to listen to the environment." Sergeant Collins shook his head in amazement. "Ma'am, we've been training for years to master the technical aspects of long-range shooting, but what you're describing sounds more like intuition." Elena smiled. "It's intuition built on decades of experience and observation. My grandfather used to say that instruments tell you what was happening, but to make an impossible shot, you need to understand what will be happening when the bullet arrives." The implications of Elena's success were immediately clear to everyone present. Not only had she solved the immediate tactical problem, but she had demonstrated an approach to extreme long-range shooting that military doctrine had never fully explored. Captain Rodriguez approached Elena with obvious respect. "Ms. Kowalski, would you be willing to share your techniques with our team? What you've accomplished here could revolutionize how we approach long-range operations." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be happy to help, Captain, but understand that what I do can't be learned quickly. It requires developing a sensitivity to natural conditions that takes years to master. You can't just read about it in a manual or practice it on a controlled range." Dr. Chen was already taking notes frantically. "Ms. Kowalski, from a scientific perspective, what you've demonstrated suggests that current ballistics calculations are missing significant environmental factors. Would you be willing to work with us to develop new methodologies that combine your intuitive approach with our technological capabilities?" The morning's demonstration had accomplished far more than just solving an immediate tactical problem. Elena Kowalski had proven that sometimes the most sophisticated military technology needed to be combined with ancient wisdom and natural understanding to achieve the impossible. As the group prepared to break up, General Morrison made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Ms. Kowalski, I'm prepared to offer you a position as a civilian contractor specializing in extreme long-range shooting consultation. Your demonstrated capabilities could save countless lives in situations where conventional approaches fail." Elena considered the offer carefully. "General, I'm honored by your confidence, but I need to ask, is this a one-time situation, or are there other missions that might require this kind of shooting?" The general's expression grew serious. "Ma'am, I can't discuss classified operations, but I can tell you that the capability you've demonstrated this morning addresses tactical challenges that our forces have been struggling with for years." As the morning ended and preparations began for the actual mission the following day, it became clear that Elena Kowalski had not just made an impossible shot. She had opened up entirely new possibilities for military marksmanship that combined the best of modern technology with time-tested natural understanding. The actual mission day arrived with weather conditions that made the previous day's demonstration look simple by comparison. Dense morning fog covered the valley, shifting wind patterns created by an approaching storm front, and intermittent rain that would clear just long enough to provide visibility before returning with renewed intensity. Elena arrived at the forward operating position 3 hours before dawn, carrying not just her rifle but additional equipment that none of the military snipers had seen before. Alongside her grandfather's modified hunting rifle, she had brought what appeared to be traditional weather-reading instruments, a collection of handmade devices that looked more like art pieces than scientific tools. "These belonged to my great-grandfather," she explained to General Morrison as she unpacked the unusual items. "He was a shepherd in the Carpathian Mountains and could predict weather changes days in advance using these instruments. At extreme shooting distances, understanding weather patterns isn't just helpful, it's essential for survival." The military meteorologist, Captain Williams, examined the devices with curiosity. "Ms. Kowalski, our satellite weather data shows highly unstable conditions throughout the target area today. Wind speeds varying from 6 to 18 miles per hour, shifting directions every few minutes, and atmospheric pressure dropping rapidly due to the incoming storm system." Elena nodded as she assembled one of her traditional instruments, an intricate arrangement of different materials suspended on nearly invisible threads. "Your satellite data tells you what the atmosphere is doing on a large scale, Captain. These instruments help me understand what's happening in the specific airspace my bullet will travel through." She positioned the devices at various points around the firing position, then spent the next hour taking readings and making notations in a worn leather journal. Her approach was methodical but completely different from the systematic computer modeling that the military team relied on. Sergeant Collins watched Elena's preparations with growing fascination. "Ma'am, yesterday's conditions were challenging, but today seems almost impossible. The visibility alone is going to make target acquisition extremely difficult." Elena looked through her rifle scope toward the target area, which was barely visible through the shifting fog. Difficult conditions actually provide advantages if you understand how to work with them instead of fighting against them. The fog and wind patterns create natural concealment for our position, and the atmospheric disturbance will help mask the sound signature of the rifle report. She pointed toward the target hillside. More importantly, these weather conditions affect enemy observation capabilities more than they affect shooting accuracy if you know how to read the patterns. Colonel Petrov will likely extend his observation time today because the weather is limiting his staff's ability to gather intelligence through other means. General Morrison checked the mission timeline. Intelligence reports confirm that the target is maintaining his daily routine despite the weather. However, our window may be extended today due to reduced visibility requiring longer observation periods. As the morning progressed, Elena continued her environmental assessment, using methods that seemed to combine scientific observation with almost mystical sensitivity to natural conditions. She tasted the air for moisture content, listened to subtle changes in wind direction by monitoring how sounds carried across the valley, and even observed the behavior of insects to understand thermal patterns. "The conditions are beginning to align," she announced as they approached the target window. "The storm front is creating a pressure differential that will actually stabilize the air column between our position and the target for approximately 3 minutes starting in about 10 minutes. Dr. Chen, monitoring with electronic instruments, looked puzzled. "Ms. Kowalski, our readings don't show the stabilization you're describing. If anything, the atmospheric conditions appear to be becoming more chaotic." Elena smiled patiently. "Dr. Chen, your instruments measure individual weather factors separately. What I'm reading is how all those factors interact to create temporary windows of opportunity. The chaos you're seeing on your instruments is actually organizing itself into a predictable pattern, but only for a very short time. She began making final adjustments to her rifle, modifications that were subtle but clearly based on her assessment of the specific conditions they would face. Unlike the previous day's demonstration, today's shot would require her to work with multiple complicating factors simultaneously. The target area remained obscured by shifting fog as they entered the mission window. Through their scopes, the military observers could barely make out the general outline of the observation deck where Colonel Petrov was expected to appear. Target building identified through thermal imaging, reported Lieutenant Hayes. However, visibility for optical confirmation remains severely limited. Elena was settling into her firing position when she suddenly held up her hand for silence. "Wait," she said quietly. "Something's changed." She spent several minutes observing the environment with intense concentration, then made rapid adjustments to her rifle configuration. "The pressure pattern shifted earlier than I expected. We have a window now, but it will only last about 90 seconds instead of 3 minutes. General Morrison felt the tension mount. "Ms. Kowalski, we've been tracking the target's movement pattern through electronic surveillance, but visual confirmation will be extremely difficult in these conditions." Elena nodded calmly. "General, at this distance and in these conditions, visual confirmation through scopes isn't reliable anyway. I'm going to have to make this shot based on intelligence data, environmental reading, and timing." The fog began to clear slightly, just as Colonel Petrov was scheduled to make his appearance. Through the shifting mist, a dark figure became briefly visible on the distant observation deck, barely more than a shadow, but clearly human. "Target confirmed," whispered Master Sergeant Thompson through his spotting scope. "Range 4,000 meters. Target is stationary, but visibility is intermittent due to fog movement." Elena's breathing had already shifted into the deep, rhythmic pattern she used for extreme distance shots. Her body alignment was perfect, but more than that, she seemed to have achieved a state of complete integration with both her rifle and the environmental conditions around her. "Conditions are optimal in 15 seconds, she said quietly, her voice perfectly calm despite the enormous pressure of the moment. The silence that followed was intense. Every person at the firing position understood that this shot carried implications far beyond just completing a mission. Elena had proven the day before that her methods could work under controlled conditions. But today would determine whether her approach could function under the extreme stress and uncertainty of actual combat conditions. Elena's finger found the trigger. For several heartbeats, she remained motionless, reading environmental cues that her instruments couldn't measure and timing factors that no computer could calculate. Then, with the same fluid motion she had demonstrated the day before, she fired. The shot rang out across the valley, the sound immediately absorbed and scattered by the fog and wind. At 4,000 meters in these conditions, even tracking the bullet's flight was nearly impossible through conventional optical means. "Time to target approximately 4.3 seconds, called Lieutenant Hayes, though his voice carried uncertainty given the difficult observation conditions. The seconds stretched endlessly as everyone strained to see through the shifting fog and determine the outcome of the shot. Electronic monitoring equipment provided some data, but visual confirmation remained elusive. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Master Sergeant Thompson's voice crackled through the communication system. "Target down! Direct hit confirmed through thermal imaging." The fog cleared momentarily, revealing the distant observation deck now empty. The mission had been accomplished with the same precision Elena had demonstrated during the previous day's range session, but under conditions that would have made a conventional long-range shot virtually impossible. General Morrison lowered his binoculars with an expression of profound respect. "Ms. Kowalski, what you accomplished today goes beyond exceptional marksmanship. You've demonstrated capabilities that could fundamentally change how we approach long-range operations." Elena was already beginning to disassemble her rifle, her manner calm and professional. "General, The shot was successful because the conditions aligned properly and the target behaved predictably. Credit also belongs to your team's intelligence gathering and mission planning. Dr. Chen approached with her instruments and notes. Ms. Kowalski, I've been recording environmental data throughout your shot preparation and execution. The conditions you predicted and the timing you achieved don't match our conventional ballistics calculations, yet the results speak for themselves. Would you be willing to help us develop new training protocols that incorporate your methodologies? Elena considered the request thoughtfully. Dr. Chen, I'd be happy to share what I know, but you need to understand that what I do can't be reduced to simple formulas or standard procedures. Each shot at extreme distance is unique because environmental conditions are never exactly the same twice. Captain Rodriguez, who had been studying Elena's techniques with professional fascination, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. Ma'am, how many people do you think could learn to shoot like this? Your grandfather's knowledge, your family's experience, is this something that could be taught to military snipers? Elena paused as she packed her equipment. Captain, the basic principles can be taught, but mastering them requires years of experience reading natural conditions. It's not just about marksmanship. It's about developing an intuitive understanding of how natural forces work together. She gestured toward the distant target area. Your military training focuses on achieving consistency and reliability, which is exactly what you need for most tactical situations. What I do is more like art. It works for extreme situations where conventional approaches fail, but it requires accepting uncertainty and working with natural forces instead of trying to control them. General Morrison had been listening to the discussion with growing understanding of the implications. Ms. Kowalski, I believe what you're describing represents a capability gap that our forces have been experiencing for years. We've been trying to solve extreme long-range challenges through technological advancement, but perhaps we've been overlooking the human element. As the mission team prepared to return to base, Elena made an observation that would influence military sniper training for years to come. General, your snipers are excellent technicians with outstanding discipline and training, but at extreme distances, you need people who can think like hunters, not just soldiers. Hunting teaches patience, environmental awareness, and the ability to work with uncertainty, qualities that become essential when you push beyond the boundaries of conventional marksmanship. The success of Elena's impossible shot had implications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Her demonstration proved that combining traditional knowledge with modern technology could achieve results that neither approach could accomplish alone. In the months that followed, Elena worked with military training programs to develop new methodologies for extreme long-range operations. Her techniques couldn't be mass-produced or reduced to simple procedures, but they provided a foundation for training elite snipers to push beyond the traditional limitations of long-range marksmanship. The simple woman who had made the impossible shot became a legend within military sniper communities, not just for her extraordinary skill, but for proving that sometimes the most advanced solutions come from understanding and respecting the fundamental forces of nature that no technology can fully control. Years later, when military historians wrote about the evolution of sniper tactics, Elena Kowalski's 4,000-meter shot would be remembered not just as an exceptional demonstration of marksmanship, but as the moment when military doctrine began to recognize that achieving the impossible sometimes requires combining ancient wisdom with modern capability. The general's challenge to his elite snipers had been answered not by superior technology or mathematical precision, but by a hunting tradition passed down through generations of mountain people who understood that, at extreme distances, success comes from working in harmony with forces that can never be completely controlled, only respected and understood.